Good afternoon and welcome to someone asked me, do you talk about the number of meetings you have? And I said, oh, as a matter of fact, today's 717. This is our 717th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. And I'm Barbara Van Ellen, President and CEO of the club. The club has been recognized as the leading nonpartisan forum for social, economic, and political issues and discussions on those for more than 100 years. We have had more than 1,000 guests here before the club during that period, and with great excellence and prominence, and that continues up till today, including today. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to students from Rutgers University and Columbia University who are joining us virtually, as well as members in the room that are part of the largest ever class of 2023 fellows, a select group of rising next-gen business thought leaders. That actually this year we have 72, and we have 3 that are actually not from the New York metro area and are from other urban centers in the US participating virtually. Today, I'm honored to welcome our special guest, the Honorable Lina Khan. Lina was sworn in as chair of the Federal Trade Commission on June 15, 2021. Prior to becoming head of the FTC, she was an associate professor of law at Columbia Law School. Lina also previously served as counsel to the U.S. House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law. She was legal advisor to FTC Commissioner Rohit Chopra and legal director of the Open Markets Institute. Her scholarship on antitrust and competition policy has been published in the Columbia Law Journal, the Harvard Law Review, the University of Chicago Law Review, and the Yale Law Review. She's a graduate of Williams College and Yale Law School. The format today will begin with prepared remarks by Lina, followed by a conversation in which we're delighted to have club member and former trustee Peter Orszag doing the honors of moderating. Peter is CEO-elect at Lazard and former director of the OMB. Time permitting, we will take audience member questions from those in the room toward the tail end of the program. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record. We do have a lot of media actually online as well as some in the room. Without further ado, the podium is yours, Lina.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much to Barbara and the whole Economic Club of New York team for hosting me today. And thanks in advance to Peter for, I'm sure, what will be a really engaging conversation. Today, I'm going to discuss why, after decades of retreat, our nation's longstanding commitment to free and fair competition has come roaring back to the forefront of public policy and what we at the Federal Trade Commission are doing to advance it. One of the first people to speak at the Economic Club of New York about the importance of open markets and fair competition was Louis Brandeis back in 1912. It was 5 years after the club's founding and just 4 days before a presidential election that had catalyzed a national debate over how government should address monopolies and concentrated economic power. In his remarks, Brandeis made the case for a new administrative board or a commission of some sort to enforce the nation's anti-monopoly law and safeguard our system of free enterprise. The idea that Brandeis proposed at this very club came to fruition 2 years later when Congress passed and President Wilson signed the Federal Trade Commission Act. The statute outlawed unfair methods of competition and created the FTC to enforce this prohibition and to regularly study markets so that it could keep pace with new trends and practices. Much has changed in the century since, but the FTC's basic job has remained the same: to promote healthy competition and stop monopolistic tactics. As Brandeis said in his speech, the maintenance of competition does not necessarily involve destructive and unrestricted competition any more than the maintenance of liberty implies license or anarchy. Unless there be regulation of competition, its excesses will lead to the destruction of competition and monopoly will take its place. This vision of enforcing the rules to safeguard free enterprise and fair competition has been a bedrock of America's dynamism and economic success. Open and competitive markets mean that the best ideas win. Businesses get ahead not through exploiting special privileges, but by competing on the merits. This national policy in favor of competition over consolidation enabled America to become an economic powerhouse. It allowed our country to harness the ingenuity and hard work of our citizens and reap breakthrough innovations and remarkable technological feats. Around 40 years ago, however, we decided to experiment with a different approach. Policymakers bought into a set of assumptions that markets tend to be perfectly competitive and self-correcting, that monopoly power is generally fleeting, and that a hands-off approach to antitrust and competition policy would deliver great efficiencies that would outweigh any costs. Today, it has become apparent that this approach delivered an economy that all too often fails to benefit most Americans. Consider some of the effects. The US spends more on healthcare per capita than any other country in the world, yet millions of Americans are left rationing or altogether skipping medicines that they need. A single storm or outbreak can suddenly trigger shortages of products ranging from IV bags to infant formula, leaving nurses and families to scramble. One technological glitch can ground tens of thousands of flights for a week, upending travel for millions. And as Taylor Swift fans can most recently attest, even buying a concert ticket is now rife with hidden mystery fees and risks of a system-wide meltdown. Around a fifth of American workers are locked down by a non-compete clause, including fast food workers, hairdressers, emergency room doctors, and security guards. The Treasury Department estimates that workers make 20% less due to labor market concentration, while also facing worse working conditions and unpredictable schedules. Small businesses across the country find themselves squeezed, not because customers don't like their products, but because they're unfairly muscled out of markets by big players. At the FTC, we routinely hear from businesses across sectors, from independent pharmacies to local grocers, about the arbitrary fees, discriminatory pricing, and coercive tactics that they face at the hands of large firms. Entrepreneurs watch as their ideas get appropriated by the gatekeepers on which they depend. Startups take on the risk of bringing a product to market, but all too often, someone else reaps the rewards. Less competition also means fewer paths to commercialization or exit, with valuations depressed. Our country is more unequal and less safe. Regional inequality has soared, with mid-sized cities cut off from reliable air service and rural communities facing food deserts and hospitals shuttered. The Defense Department has said that consolidation, with the defense industrial base having shrunk from 51 firms to 5, now poses a risk to national security. Consolidation meant that after a Louisiana factory blew up, our military lost access to its only domestic source of an essential type of gunpowder. And 2 years later, we still haven't gotten it back. Empirical research, too, has documented rising consolidation, declining competition, and a resulting assortment of economic ills and risks. Jumpstarting some of this scholarship was a 2015 paper by leading economists and top Obama administration officials, Jason Furman and Peter Orszag, whose work advanced the idea that concentration was on the rise and that declines in competition could be playing a causal role in widening economic inequality. Given the growing empirical evidence and experience from lived reality, President Biden in 2021 announced a break with this experiment. He said, 40 years ago, we chose the wrong path and pulled back on enforcing laws to promote competition. I believe the experiment failed. By signing his executive order on promoting competition, the president put fair, open, and competitive markets back at the center of our economic policy. The EO reflects the best of America's longstanding anti-monopoly tradition, renewed and updated for a modern economy. It builds on new economic learning, revising the overly simplistic theories of markets that had underpinned our prior approach. And it recognizes that questions of market structure and competition determine not just the price and quantity of goods, but also the trajectory of innovation, the shape of economic opportunity, the resiliency of our markets, and the strength of our democracy. This reorientation on competition policy goes hand in hand with a broader set of policy changes currently underway. Across domains, including trade, economics, national security, we are seeing the need to revisit one-dimensional, outdated assumptions about how markets work and update our approach to meet the challenges of today. Earlier this year, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, in a seminal speech, tied unchecked corporate concentration to the fraying of the socioeconomic foundations on which any strong and resilient democracy rests. That was the very debate happening here at the Economic Club of New York more than a century ago. And America's decision then to recommit to competition helped establish the United States as the strongest economy and democracy the world has ever known. Against this backdrop, the FTC is firing on all cylinders, using all of our tools to promote free and fair competition in the modern economy. First, we are tackling business practices that unlawfully muscle out rivals or impede competition. Last year, we sued 2 pesticide giants for schemes that blocked farmers from accessing lower cost alternatives, resulting in farmers and the food-eating public being overcharged by billions of dollars. We're also scrutinizing whether dominant middlemen in pharmaceutical markets are exercising their power in ways that hike drug prices for patients and squeeze independent pharmacies. In January, we proposed a rule that would eliminate non-compete clauses from employment contracts. Our proposal follows extensive research showing that non-competes harm competition in labor markets, creating mismatches between workers and firms and reducing wages even for workers not directly covered by non-competes. These clauses also impede entrepreneurial growth, depriving new firms of access to talent and dampening competition in product and service markets as well. Our proposed rule estimates that banning non-competes in employment contracts would raise worker wages by up to $300 billion and cut healthcare spending by up to $150 billion. Second, we are scrutinizing mergers and blocking deals that may threaten competition. Robust merger enforcement is our first line of defense against unlawful consolidation, as preventing markets from becoming illegally monopolized is more effective than later trying to affect the symptoms and effects of monopoly power. Shortly after I became chair, we successfully blocked NVIDIA's attempted acquisition of ARM, what would have been the biggest semiconductor chip merger in history. Our investigation found that the deal would have risked stifling innovation and next-generation technologies, including in data centers and self-driving cars. The case also highlighted how competition policy can be a key component of industrial strategy, inducing productive investment and resilient markets. Last year, the FTC also successfully challenged Lockheed's attempted acquisition of Aerojet, the first time in decades that the agency had gone to court to stop consolidation in the defense industry. As we noted in our complaint, the deal would have taken out the last independent supplier of critical missile inputs, threatening to jack up the prices that our government pays. When needed, we're also updating our tools and frameworks. Last week, we published a draft revision of our merger guidelines, the enforcement manual that the FTC and Justice Department use to analyze deals. Informed by over 5,000 public comments and several listening sessions with market participants across the country, the updates are designed to reflect the realities of how businesses grow and compete in today's economy. Lastly, we are working to tackle unfair and deceptive practices, the kinds of daily indignities that waste people's time, undermine their privacy, and siphon away their money. For example, we're taking on dark patterns and other manipulative design tactics that firms use to trick people into making a purchase or handing over their data. We've proposed a rule that will require companies to make it as easy to cancel a subscription as it is to sign up for one. And we're scrutinizing junk fees, the unnecessary, unavoidable, or surprise charges that appear, for example, when buying a hotel room or sports ticket. Taking on unfair or deceptive practices encourages a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. Permitting firms to compete through lying about their prices or privacy policies, for example, ends up disadvantaging honest businesses. And setting baseline rules about the practices that are or are not fair game can instead help ensure that firms are competing on the dimensions that we want to promote. As artificial intelligence tools become more widely adopted, we again hear from some that the time has come to embrace consolidation over competition. Especially as other nations directly prop up national champions, it can be tempting to adopt the view that we are entering a new global arms race where success requires protecting and promoting domestic monopolies. Our history, once again, can be instructive. During the Cold War, as antitrust enforcers investigated IBM and AT&T for anti-competitive tactics, they faced arguments that we should instead shield these firms from competition in order to win globally. But enforcers were not persuaded that protecting monopolies was the path to long-term success. They correctly trusted that sticking with America's system of free and fair competition would out-innovate a centralized system of state-run monopolies. Facing antitrust scrutiny in the 1960s, IBM unbundled software from its hardware systems, catalyzing the rise of American software and the software industry and creating trillions of dollars in growth. Antitrust action requiring AT&T to open up its patent vault similarly unleashed decades of innovation, spurring the expansion of countless young firms. An antitrust action against Microsoft stopped the personal computing giant from leveraging its market power to centralize control over the internet and block competition, ultimately allowing scrappy startups like Google and Amazon to grow and bring their services to market. The strength of America has long been its combination of democratic government and open, competitive markets that offer opportunity and upward mobility. From our founding, this political economy set us apart from more centralized systems. And our history shows that enforcing the rules to protect open, fair, and competitive markets has been a key ingredient in our economic and democratic success. The FTC is currently at the forefront of the whole of government effort to put free and fair competition back at the center of policy. And if we succeed, the American economy can emerge more innovative and more prosperous, with our democracy stronger and more resilient. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
For those comments. We have a lot of questions that members have submitted ahead of time and that I have, and so I just wanted to start off by thanking you for being here today. I remember very well being with you on a panel in 2017 at the University of Chicago. I think that same year you graduated from law school, and now look at you. So we'll come back to some of the biographical questions maybe towards the end if we have time. But I wanted to jump right into questions that are on people's minds and some of the questions that we've received from the New York community in particular. And maybe just to go right to the heart of a perception, which may or may not be correct, I think that it's fair to say that in many parts of the New York deal community, there's a perception that underlying your approach to antitrust in particular is some degree of aversion or hostility to M&A overall. Do you want to expand on whether there are any benefits of deal making and what you see them as being?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question because I definitely think it is a perception out there. First of all, just to put things in context, any given year, the antitrust agencies get anywhere between 1,500 to 3,000 merger filings. Of that number, 98% go through without even any second questions being asked by the agencies. So around 2% of all deals even get what's known as a second request, which is, a set of questions so that we can do a deeper investigation. And an even smaller fraction ultimately result in a legal challenge. So vast majority of deals still going through. There is, the antitrust statutes that Congress passed, including the Clayton Act, lays out that mergers that may substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly are unlawful. And critically, Congress used the word may. And it did so for a couple of reasons, in part because, merger enforcement is always a predictive exercise, right? We can never know with total certainty what's going to happen. And so it's basically a risk assessment that we have to do. There are a whole set of factors that we look at, and the merger guidelines that we put out are designed to really do a full canvassing of the existing law, look at some of the market developments that we've been seeing, and really provide clarity and guidance, including to the business community, to identify what types of deals with what types of issues are the ones that are going to be raising legal concerns. Again, 98% of deals going through without even a second question. It's really an issue on the margins about the types of deals that I think in hindsight, we realize ultimately ended up lessening competition, leading some of the problems that I mentioned that we want to make sure we're course correcting for.
So let me just ask though, on the other 98%, the ones that go through, do you see those as just things that are not blocked, or are they affirmatively good in some way or helpful for the economy?
It's difficult to generalize. Obviously, these vary on a case-by-case basis. For us as enforcers, it's really not about deciding which deals are good and which deals are bad. We really are charged with looking at it through a law enforcement perspective, which is also candidly the expertise that we have, right? I mean, we are not business people. We're not in the business of figuring out, why is this deal going to be good? We're really purely looking at it through a law enforcement frame. We have heard in the past that sometimes certain types of acquisitions are necessary for commercialization or really the only exit path, especially since IPOs is no longer as much of an available path. So those are arguments that we hear, we think about. An instance where you have, a pharma deal that's an acquisition of a very, very early stage drug is going to land differently than an acquisition of a fully formed, very popular drug. So those are types of things that we look at and think about.
Okay, we'll come back to some of that on the merger guidelines too in a second. But there's another perception out there about an aversion to big business, that big is bad. So do you want to comment on that? Are there benefits to big businesses? And if so, what do you see those as being?
So again, the role of the FTC is not to have our own personal philosophical beliefs about the virtues of big versus small. It's really about the statutes, right? Congress, when passing the antitrust statutes, was setting out a policy preference in many cases for competition over monopoly, right? That said, the statutes don't prohibit being a monopoly. They only prohibit becoming a monopoly through illegal tactics. And so that's the sort of thing that we look at. Historically, competition has been a key set of principles for some domains, but we've also seen other domains where economies of scale, network externalities require you to have big business. And in those instances, our government historically has applied a different set of tools to make sure that big firms, if they're not going to be checked and disciplined by competition, that there are a different set of rules that are available to check their power. So, historically, we've seen different paradigms. Our paradigm primarily is competition, but there are certainly instances in which you need to have big firms to be able to deliver the types of services at scale that we need.
So just to stay on this for a second, you referenced the paper with Jason Furman, which really talked about a growing disparity or dispersion in capital returns and productivity and a whole variety of different forces or factors across firms, which could be caused by lack of competition, but it could also be caused by a whole bunch of other things. And so I wanted you to maybe comment a little bit, and it was in your remarks too, on the causal linkage between the thing that you are kind of aiming at, anti-competitive behavior, and a whole set of social ills that may or may not be causally linked to that. And I want to read something from a big fan of yours, Matt Stoller, who recently wrote a couple days ago, nearly every major dangerous social trend today, from wage inequality to regional collapse to social despair to the inability to efficiently shift energy resources, is a result of monopolization. Do you think that's right?
Look, I'm wary of generalizing to that degree, but I think there has been a way in which we've seen monopolization and concentration sit upstream from a whole set of problems, including some of the ones that I mentioned. Your question, though, seems to be the first part of your question seems slightly different, which is, if we are seeing that concentration, to what extent is it a product of firms just being better versus engaging in anti-competitive tactics, which I think is a really important question and goes back to this first order issue of, are there certain domains when competition is not going to be the prevailing paradigm and we instead are going to see, oligopolies or monopolies, and so we need a different set of rules?
Well, let's just stay on that for a second. So Nick Bloom at Stanford, along with others, have done research into this dispersion across firms and what leads to some firms outperforming and gaining market share. And what he would say is part of what happens here is better management teams, better use of technology can lead to growth and often also lead to benefits from mergers, and that you can't look at price markups or concentration and conclude that the underlying driver has been lack of enforcement of the antitrust rules or what have you. I'd still say the tone of most of the discussion, including the excellent remarks that you gave, suggests putting much more weight on the anti-competitive behavior as opposed to lots of other potential causes of that concentration. Do you want to unpack that a little bit? Do you have anything more you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I would think that area of focus is really a result of the job that I have, which is to be identifying and rooting out these anti-competitive tactics. But you're absolutely right that, there are a whole set of factors and causes that can be driving some of these trends that we see. I think, you mentioned profit margins and concentration, which are important ones. I think one that's often top of mind for me, because it's actually very difficult to measure, is innovation. And this goes back to, the longstanding debate between Arrow and Schumpeter about, what are the right conditions to best favor innovation, right? Unsurprisingly, it depends, right? The type of innovation that you want to be promoting. And, there's a big literature. I'm not even going to try to attempt to summarize it. But I think big picture, we've seen that for the types of breakthrough innovations that are really paradigm shifting, competition is a better bet. Because oftentimes, incumbents are already invested in their existing technologies. There can also just be a kind of winnowing down and narrowing of the imagination that happens. It's really the disruptors that are most responsible for the breakthrough innovations that we've seen historically. Big firms can be really great at the more marginal innovations that can lead to, product improvements. They obviously have a lot more that they can be reinvesting. And so I think those are the types of questions that are especially challenging for us, because how you quantify the innovation that's been lost is extremely difficult. And one conversation that's happening very much now around some of the state of digital markets. And so I think given the challenges of never being able to really get back what's been lost or even being able to quantify it, I think historically, and if you go back to the legislative debates, that's also why Congress in many instances.
I'm going to come back to Congress too, I promise. But let's turn to some recent cases. The noted philosopher Mike Tyson, once said, "Everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face." And the historical success rate in court cases for the FTC, estimates vary, but something like 3/4. Recently, it's not been that. But you correctly note that you lose every case you don't bring. So I'm just wondering how you think about, in a kind of almost Bayesian way, are you thinking about adapting your approach in the face of recent court decisions, or full speed ahead?
So we in federal court have lost 2 merger cases. We have brought somewhere between 13 and 20, depending on how you count, and have gotten abandonment. So in the scheme of our merger enforcement program, losing 2 is okay. Obviously, we only bring cases that we think we should win, that we can win. Every time we have that type of setback, we look very closely at, where could we have done better? Where did we fall short? And use that to inform our approach going forward. Some of these setbacks have been interesting because even in instances where we didn't actually win the preliminary injunction, we got clarifications on case law. So we attempted to block Meta's acquisition of Within on what's known as a potential competition theory, one that has not been, robustly litigated in recent decades. The argument in response that we got was, this is an old doctrine, it doesn't apply in these markets, and even if it did, it wouldn't really make sense. The judge resoundingly rejected that and actually laid out in some detail why it is that potential competition in these markets is so important. He said things like, even if you have a market where you're seeing a lot of rapid entry and exit, that's not a proxy for thinking there's no competition problem, because you can still have an incumbent. So things that are slightly in the weeds and seem like maybe not all that helpful, but in the scheme of programmatically wanting to move forward and being able to clarify the law, update the law, instances where we want to be understanding from the courts, how do these traditional principles, some of which haven't not been litigated very recently, apply in these new contexts? That type of clarification is always very helpful.
So let me just ask, though, because the success rate has differed between horizontal cases and vertical ones. The vertical cases are where I think most people think there's a more marked departure from historical precedent, which maybe you can agree or disagree with. Any updated thinking on vertical cases in particular?
Look, there's no question that vertical mergers can be tougher to litigate. Actually, the two merger challenges that I mentioned our challenge to NVIDIA's acquisition of ARM and Lockheed Aerojet, both vertical challenges. We filed those within the first 6 to 8 months of my joining. Shortly after we filed, the parties walked away. Those were opportunities to litigate vertical mergers that we didn't have. We were happy, we saved resources, but I do think that there have been instances in which we've seen even a step forward there. In 2017 or 18, whenever it was that the DOJ filed its challenge to AT&T Time Warner, at that moment in time, there was just a real sense of surprise. And I think you saw a lot of commentary saying the government almost never challenges vertical mergers. These are presumptively beneficial. You didn't see that type of commentary when we filed Lockheed and NVIDIA. And so I think there has even been a step forward in thinking about, okay, what are the red flags? What are the types of risks that are created that are going to make it more likely that one of these is going to run into legal issues?
So I know you can't comment on specific cases, I won't ask you to, but there is a appeal that's occurring in the Fifth Circuit in the Luna case that challenges the administrative law, the administrative court part of the FTC. Can you articulate why, and this is one of the questions that came in from a member, why is that court system needed? And why not just use the regular federal court system?
So for those who aren't deeply familiar with the mechanics of the FTC, we, like many other federal administrative agencies, have the option of either filing a lawsuit in federal court or filing it what's known in our in-house administrative adjudication. The process is that initially an administrative law judge, if we file it in-house, will take a first crack at it, we'll kind of make the key findings of fact and law, and then an appeal is available to the commission, and then, very critically, the commission's opinion can always be appealed to any federal court of appeals. It's an interesting question to think about, why did Congress design the FTC or all these other agencies this way? And you especially see agencies that have, very high levels of litigation, including things like, Social Security disputes and that sort of thing, rely especially on this. For the FTC, Congress was really adamant that, just to step back, the reason Congress created the FTC is because Congress was frustrated by how antitrust law was developing in the courts. Shortly after the Standard Oil decision, which is mostly known for breaking up Standard Oil, Congress basically jumped into high gear to create the FTC. And that was because in the Standard Oil decision, the courts had introduced what's known as the rule of reason standard, which basically said that the courts on a case-by-case basis are going to look very closely at the facts and determine how does the antitrust law apply. And Congress really saw this opinion as a power grab by the courts, and they worried that the judiciary being exclusively in the driver's seat on the development of antitrust law was a problem. And so they explicitly created the FTC to have these commissioners that are supposed to be, coming with expertise for them to be able to study very closely what's happening in the market. And so Congress wanted the FTC commissioners to also be effectively playing a role in the development of antitrust law. So that was the history of why Congress gave us this function. But it's not unique to the FTC. There are a whole set of other administrative agencies, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, that have a similar feature. And the challenges that you're seeing in the courts to this type of administrative adjudication is also happening agency-wide.
Okay, let's turn to the new proposed merger guidelines that you mentioned. I think that they are seen, and you can correct this impression, as a significant departure, or at least materially different from previous guidelines. And in the context, I'll ask a couple questions about the guidelines in a second, but in the context of that, you've referred to, and I think you did in your opening remarks also, something that you've said with regard to existing cases, you're just following the law. The law hasn't changed, the guidelines have. So I understand that the economy has changed, but is it really you're just mechanically following the law, or is the law elastic enough to allow different interpretations of it? Because if not, how do you explain a significantly different set of guidelines unless prior FTCs were not actually following the law?
So what we did when setting off on this revision process was actually go and make a list of every litigated merger decision, starting with the Supreme Court, starting with the Court of Appeal, a whole set of district court decisions, and went and actually set out to figure out what is the law on mergers. When we went through that exercise, I think we did see areas where there had been divergence between what some of the guidelines had said previously and what the law said. More often, there were just whole areas of doctrine that were not frontally acknowledged in the guidelines. And so we wanted to make sure that this document was faithfully canvassing the law actually on the books, both in terms of the statutes that Congress passed and, a close analysis of the text, but also what remains good prevailing law. Many of the decisions, including ones from the 60s and 70s, are ones that are still routinely cited in modern merger decisions, right? I mean, just one decision that came down the other week for us, was citing heavily the Brown Shoe decision, which is one of these ones from the 60s. And so there has been a way in which merger decisions have not reached the Supreme Court with the same level of frequency that we were seeing some decades ago. And so that older law is still good law in antitrust, like in any other area of law. There is no statute of limitations for a prevailing Supreme Court decision. There's no expiration date. That remains good law unless and until a Supreme Court decision subsequently overturns it. And again, for antitrust lawyers, these cases are still the bread and butter. They're being cited in briefs back and forth all the time. But we wanted to make sure that these guidelines were being fully faithful to the law, to a whole set of doctrines, to make sure that the market was fully on notice.
Okay. So there are, I'm not a lawyer, you are, but your citation of previous cases in the guidelines did attract attention because that was not the norm historically, I gather. But the specific cases that you cited have also garnered attention because the assertion is, and I'm hoping you can just comment on it, that you picked some cases that were, decades in the past and skipped a bunch of more recent cases. Is that fair or not fair?
I don't think it's fair. I'd be curious to see which cases people think we've left out, but we've cited cases in there that led to adverse outcomes for the Justice Department and the FTC. The most recent one being United States versus sugar. This was the Justice Department's effort to block a sugar merger. We got an adverse decision like 3 days before the merger guidelines went out. We included a citation because they stood for an important proposition of law. It is true, these are the first merger guidelines that are citing to law. We saw that as a feature, not a bug. If these guidelines are designed to faithfully represent what the law is, we wanted to make sure we were kind of showing our work.
Okay. You've also proposed some changes in the HSR filing requirements for smaller mergers that are just over the guideline thresholds. How do you evaluate I could call it a merger tax, the additional costs in terms of inefficiencies from law firm, not that law firms are inefficient, but from the paperwork and the other filing requirements that are associated with those additional requirements, which I think have been estimated at $350 million or so a year. Do you have any way in which you balance the benefit of the additional information against the cost of complying with it? And some people think, again, I'm trying to give you an opportunity to respond to all the things that might be helpful to clarify, that it was a purposeful approach to try to kind of impose a merger tax.
So this is the Hart-Scott-Rodino form that merging parties fill out if their deal is kind of above the threshold. Just to step back, so this is a regime that's been in place since the mid-70s. And the idea was that if the antitrust agencies are getting a heads up on deals, they'll have an opportunity to block them before they consummate, or the vast majority of deals don't pose legal issues, granting more certainty to businesses. As part of that statutory scheme, the agencies only get 30 days from the day that a deal filing comes in to determine whether even to take a closer look. And it's really interesting if you go back to the legislative history, Congress basically thought that we would get 150 merger filings a year. That number has dramatically exploded, but we still only get 30 days. And, I came into office during a huge surge in deal making. We were seeing 70% increases year over year. The number of people that we had stayed the same. Just enormous strains on our staff in terms of being able to get the information they needed to quickly be able to decide, are there legal issues here or not? And so this project partly stemmed out of that experience. This form had not been substantively updated since the 1970s. One of my colleagues likes to say, the form had basically been designed to figure out if you're paying the right filing fee, rather than providing to the agencies an accurate snapshot of whether there are certain competition issues. So that was the context for why we wanted to do this update. For a whole set of deals, especially ones that are fairly straightforward between, direct competitors, my sense is that it's not going to be creating that much additional burden. I think for us, we also see it as facilitating a more efficient and effective review process, where if we can decide, on day 29, hey, we've already gotten all this information, looking at it, we determined there is no issue here, we're hoping that can also provide more certainty to the business community.
So you mentioned some of the burden on your staff. One of the other things that reporting has suggested is that the number of second requests, so after that first period, has increased substantially, which obviously involves a lot more work. And I guess the question is, are you concerned that with a fixed budget, and I know you may not want to accept a fixed budget, but within a fixed budget of resources for the agency, that all that additional work means that there may be some deals that are not getting the scrutiny that they deserve?
It's definitely a big challenge for us. And I think one challenge in particular is that it's a constantly fluid process, right? And so a deal that you might decide today warrants a second look, and therefore you want to send out a second request. Next week, you might decide you need to deprioritize because there's another filing that's come in that seems to raise even more flagrant issues. So it's really a dynamic process, and one that we have to be very nimble to be able to make those types of trade-offs, because again, we don't know, we're making decisions, based on what we know today, but there are filings coming in every week. So it's definitely a challenge, one that we're, doing our best to be able to navigate. Again, hoping that being able to get more information on day one. And some of this information is stuff that's pretty readily available to the parties, right? It's org charts and things that we just can skip over all the back and forth that happens to happen, hoping that that can just streamline a lot of this analysis going forward.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions in 1 second. By the way, I have plenty other questions if people in the audience don't have any, which I doubt. But let me just ask you one final question about the FTC staff. I remember being 37, coming into the Congressional Budget Office. It's a big thing to lead a new organization or lead a government organization at a relatively young age, not as young as you are. But to do so then when you're also shifting course is particularly challenging. And I wanted to see if you wanted to talk at all about your leadership style. There have been concerns about morale at the FTC, and the Partnership for Public Service surveys that show some concern. The number of departures shows some concern. How are you approaching that set of questions?
Look, so we at the FTC are just enormously privileged to have, extremely talented, hardworking career staff that are, day after day, just totally out-resourced by the companies that they're going up against. There's no doubt that, when I came in, I think a lot of people were like, what is she doing here? A fraction of my age. I think it's also true that, my career previously had been focused on critiquing the approaches of prior administrations and, the decisions that prior FTCs had made. And I can definitely see how, how that critic being put into this position could create some frictions. And I think I could have, and our team should have done a much better job making very clear that those types of critiques were not intended in any way to be kind of impugning the integrity or questioning the talent and skill of our career staff. All of these decisions are made by political leadership. And so you always want to be very clear about where you're kind of assigning any of that responsibility. I think the other big thing is, there's been an enormous amount of learning over the last decade, right? I mean, the policy choices and the conversations that are happening today are very different from the ones that are happening even when you were in government. And partly that's because we've learned a lot, right? And it's okay to be revising or reorienting our approach when we get that new evidence or new information, or kind of do a look back and make determinations about where there might need to be a course correction. So I think all of that's very healthy, and again, just feel very honored to be serving day in and day out with the people we have at the FTC.
All right, we're gonna open it up. There's only one requirement, which is you actually ask a question. So, in the back.
Hi, I'm Jay Markowitz with Arch Venture Partners. Thank you both for this excellent discussion and presentation. Working at a firm that's involved in company creation in the life sciences, I am all for your comments, Lina, about the importance of innovation. And in this industry, the ecosystem really the innovative ecosystem relies on licensing and M&A between the big companies that are losing drugs coming off patent and having to reinvent themselves on average every 13 years or so, and the smaller, more innovative companies, which are the sources of innovation. And when folks like me view some of the policies that may be putting a damper on the ability of the bigger companies to provide the capital necessary to fund the creation of some of these new products, we're very concerned that your well-intended efforts will stop the flow of important new drugs, which is really the way to bring drug prices down. More good drugs will mean more competition, better health for people, and lower prices. So I'm curious if you could just comment on your appreciation for this particular ecosystem and what you can do to reduce anti-competitive practices, but at the same time, improve or maintain the vibrancy of such a vital industry. Thank you.
Happy to. And while you still have the mic, actually, a quick question. Are there specific actions that we've done that are raising these concerns in particular, just so I can speak more specifically to it?
The biggest and most obvious one was Amgen, Horizon, but there are also further questions now about Pfizer, Seattle Genetics. I don't know, I know one of our portfolio companies, a very small company, wants to do a licensing deal with a big company, and the FTC has intervened in that. So those are three, that come to mind. Thank you.
Got it. That's helpful. And look, this type of hearing what folks in your seat are thinking about and seeing is always very helpful for us. I'll say as a general matter, pharma is certainly an area that we are looking at very closely, both on the merger side as well as on the anti-competitive practices side. The merger that you mentioned, Horizon Amgen, that the FTC is challenging, can't talk in detail about it, but what we laid out in the complaint was a concern about some of this cross-market bundling that our staff in the complaint note, they have concerns that this could happen. In instances where you have, newer drugs or drugs that have not fully come to market and they need to be bought out in order to go down the commercialization chain that you mentioned, that provides a very different set of facts than instances in which we see acquisitions of existing blockbuster drugs. So those are distinctions that we keep in mind. I think the other thing is that we've also heard from some capital allocators about the ways in which having a smaller number of exit paths or just a handful of companies that are going to provide that commercialization, that there is a worry that in and of itself is also dampening the valuation or kind of impeding their ability to actually negotiate on the deal terms. And so even if at the end of the day, you're going to have some of those acquisitions for that commercialization path, more competition and more jostling among the potential buyers, we think is ultimately also going to be better for the innovators themselves, as well as ultimately for the trajectory of innovation.
Can I just come in on this for a second? Because I think it was in the guidelines, but I've seen it elsewhere. You cite, I think to the Supreme Court, a preference for internal growth rather than inorganic acquisitions or any kind of external relationship as being just more attractive from a economic and social perspective. writ large. Can you articulate a little bit why?
So in the guidelines, we quote the case law
Yeah.
and quote, Congress. And so it's really a question of Congress articulating this preference and Supreme Court interpreting that law and noting that preference. Even for Congress, it wasn't categorical, right? Congress didn't say all mergers are prohibited. They said mergers that may lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly are prohibited. And so there really is kind of a line there. And if it's, in certain contexts where you've already seen a trend to concentration or trend towards monopolization, those are instances in which Congress has instructed us to be more vigilant. As to why, there's a lot of legislative history that I think shows Congress was choosing competition over consolidation because they thought that it correlated with a whole set of important outcomes and values, some of them economic, some of them democratic.
Any final question? All right, I'll take, last one over there. Save me from the last one.
Sure. Thanks so much. In your introduction remarks, you brought in the scope of optimizing not just for the cost to the consumer or price to the consumer, but also auxiliary factors like resilience and innovation. Those have ramifications on things like return on equity, return on capital, cost of capital, and other things. So how do you think about balancing those different set of factors when previously the FTC had been more focused on that singular factor?
And can you just comment, what if they're in conflict? So what if something's, bad for consumers, but good for workers / small businesses? How do you reconcile the competing objectives? Yeah,
it's a great question, and actually one on which there is a Supreme Court decision on point, where the court basically said that because the law says that harms to competition in any line of commerce are what's prohibited, it's really not the job of the FTC or the DOJ to be engaging in some type of cross-market balancing, where it's not for us to be subordinating the interests of consumers in order to make conditions better for workers, or to be subordinating the interests of workers for consumers. You really have to do a market-by-market analysis, and if there is a lessening of competition that's going to be bad for a set of market participants, that's something that under the law is illegal. From a prosecutorial discretion perspective, of course, these are things that we think about, but at the level of the law actually explicitly discourages and even prohibits us from engaging in that type of cross-balancing exercise, because courts worried that it would kind of put us in the position of being some type of regulator making social trade-offs. That's not really our job.
Okay, well, if everyone could join me in thanking the chair for some excellent comments and remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really great. I appreciate you doing this.
Well, many thanks to you both for an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Lina and Peter. I just want to mention that we're coming up on the tail end of July here in terms of programming. We'll host Jesse Van Tol, the president and CEO of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, for a webinar Thursday, the 27th. And looking ahead in terms of the fall, on September 11th, we'll have a signature luncheon focused on a panel of Medal of Honor recipients. And that will be moderated by the chair of the National Medal of Honor Museum Foundation, who's also chair of the NFL Foundation. On September 14th, we'll have a luncheon featuring Sergio Armati, the group chief executive of UBS. So that should be pretty exciting. On September 18th, we have a webinar with Kent Smetters, the Botner Professor of Business Economics Public Policy at the Wharton School, to hear about their budget model. And on September 27th, we have a luncheon featuring Brian Moynihan, Chair and CEO of Bank of America. I have to tell you, there's some major things in the wind that aren't yet confirmed that hit September. So keep your eye on our September calendar. I'd like to, as always, take a moment to recognize those of our 362 members of the Centennial Society joining us today, as their contributions continue to represent the financial backbone of support for the club, which is, as you all know, a 501c3. Thank you to all who are attending virtually. We're going to say goodbye. And for those in the room, please enjoy your lunch. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the summer. Thank you.